Hi. Thank you so much for joining me for another installment of ASMR True Crime and Tapping. Today we are going to talk about a case that you might have heard of, but you might not have heard the ending to this case because it is technically a solved case, though unofficially, and it comes from Germany and was requested by a good friend of mine. I thought that it would be a good story, a good case to go over as we wrap the year up, as it is probably one of the most fascinating cases that I have ever heard of when I had first heard of it, which was a few years ago now. And it is called the Hinterkaifeck Murders. Let's begin. Now, this case actually takes place throughout a few different days, starting in March of 1922. So the murders themselves took place between March 31st and April 1st of that year, but certain aspects of the crime or the lead up to the crime was actually happening slightly before that, which I will get into. As I said, this case took place in a town called Hinterkaifeck. And before I go on, I will apologize. I do have a few viewers who are German-speaking viewers, and I'm going to apologize if I butcher any names during this reading, this retelling. And secondly, we will also be, as normal, paying respect to the victims, so we will not be making jokes or any sort of comedy out of this retelling of the case. It is a very serious and heinous crime that happened to this family, and it was a disservice that it was not solved in the lifetime of the people involved. Let's get into it then. So, 70 kilometers or 43 miles north of Munich, Germany, in March of 1922, a family of 6 people were murdered on their farm in a town called Hinterkaifeck. And this family was a couple, an older couple called Andreas and Kazilla, and their last name was Gruber. They were 63 and 72 years of age. They had a daughter called Victoria. Her last name was Gabriel, and she had 2 children, Josef and Kazilla, and they were 2 and 7 years old, and their daughter was 35. Victoria was age 35. She was actually a widower, and her husband, we will get into him a little bit later, but he perished in World War I, though his body was never found. And during this time, 6 months before the murders, before March of 1922, they had a long-term maid that was working at their farm, and this maid had reported hearing sounds like a person walking in the attic of their farmhouse, and they sort of laughed it off at first, and then she quit due to the fact that it was prevalent, and there are rumors that she was superstitious about it and possibly thought that the property was haunted, and that's why she quit. But she would quit 6 months before the murders took place, and this will be important. This aspect of why I'm mentioning this will be important to the case itself. And then a few days before the murders happened, neighbors and Andreas himself noticed certain odd happenings going on around the farm, such as hearing noises in the attic, finding a mysterious newspaper on his property, which he was not a subscriber of, and finding footprints in the freshly fallen snow that led to a machine shed on his property. But when he searched all of these locations, he never found anyone or anything to be suspicious of. His neighbors actually encouraged him to call the police, and he did not do so. Now we get to the crime itself that started or was initiated on March 31st of that year, 1922. So a new maid arrived, she was also eventually killed in the murders. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old, and her sister actually accompanied her to essentially drop her off to this, her new job that day. The sister would actually become the last known person to see the family and her own sister alive before they were found days later murdered. And she didn't report anything was amiss when the murders, before the murders happened. She accompanied her sister to the farm and said goodbye to her. Nothing was out of place. And then late in the evening, investigators believe, is when the murders first started occurring. So the killer hid out in the barn on the property and lured the family members, save for the maid and the youngest son, Josef, to the barn one by one and killed them. And he killed them, and I will go into the kind of weapon that he used, but it was not a clean killing. And as with the last case that I covered, which was the Cleveland torso murders, I will not go into the grisly details of the case, but I do encourage you to look up more details about the method of the killing in this case after you watch this video, if you feel like knowing or finding out about it. But for the sake of not getting too deep into this, I will forego the gruesome details. But then he went into the house after killing Andreas and Kazilla, Victoria and Kazilla, her daughter, went into the house and killed Josef and Maria in their bedrooms, their respective bedrooms. Four days would pass before the bodies were found. In the interim time, two men came to the farm who had business with Andreas, and they tried to locate the family inside the house by knocking and just seeing if anyone was home from their vantage point, and they could not tell if anyone was present in the home. And also during this time, this period of 4 days, Kazilla, the daughter, did not show up for school, nor did the family appear at church. So neighbors quickly discovered that something was, amiss. And shortly after this, they formed a group who would go onto the property and investigate the goings on of what was happening. So this was on April 4th of 1922, so a few days later, and the neighbors would end up walking around the property and eventually finding the 4 bodies in the barn, and then entering the home and finding the 2 other bodies in their rooms. Now, this small town, there was no police service of their own. They did not have a police service of their own. So they had to call in investigators from Munich. And these investigators showed up by the time they got to the farmhouse to investigate the scene. The entire house had been turned upside down by neighbors. So these neighbors had essentially disturbed the crime scene, which as anyone would know, especially if you were a true crime enthusiast, is not a suggested situation. And even in 1922, this was considered something that they needed to do when they were investigating this case. So police initially had a very difficult time collecting really any solid evidence because of the neighbors, coming into the home and investigating on their own before they could show up. And then they were able, however, to determine that the murder weapon, as I started mentioning before, was something called a mattock, which looks like a pickaxe. So you can Google that if you're interested in what it looks like. But it also sort of looks like a hatchet, where it has a small axe on one end, and then it looks like a hammer on the other side. So this is a very aggressive weapon to be using if you're going to murder someone. This is quite heavily intended to hurt or kill. The killer was clearly motivated to carry out their actions. And unfortunately, this once again, this will probably be the most gruesome detail I mentioned in this case. The daughter, Kazilla, was lured into the barn, but she was not killed. She did not die right away. She actually died sitting in the hay in the barn, and they do not know how long she was alive after she was struck with this weapon. However, she was alive long enough to pull her own hair out, presumably from suffering from her wounds, or possibly even seeing other family members be struck down by the killer. They, of course, investigators do not know this distinctively because of the fact that there were no witnesses that were left alive during the crime. Robbery, though, was quickly ruled out in this case due to the fact that a large sum of money was found in the home when investigators turned up in plain sight. So they were able to walk into the home and find the sum of money within reach. It was not difficult to see, or was not hidden where someone would be looking for something like that. So, or if they saw it, they would have taken it if it was a robbery. And police quickly pushed that aside. And then further investigation, and this is why this case is such a particularly creepy one for many people, the detail of the killer living in the home for at least 3 days after he killed the family. So he was living on the property. He was feeding the animals, and they found an entire loaf of bread was eaten, like a loaf of bread that was meant for the family itself, as they would have been doing shopping, groceries weekly, was eaten by this one individual, and meat in the pantry was actually also eaten by this individual. So he was living on the property for some time and then left about a day or so before neighbors discovered the bodies. Now, suspects. Since this case happened in 1922 and is considered to this day unsolved, there are not many solid leads to go off of. There were quite a lot of suspects, however, and this case was investigated actively for about a decade after the murders happened. So there were inquests that went all the way out to 1927 where neighbors were still being interviewed and not really put on trial per se, but given depositions, if you know the term, you can Google that if you don't know what the scope of a deposition is, but just essentially being interviewed by the police multiple times and having it be recorded even up to 1927. And so even after all that time, they weren't able to discover who had definitively done this crime, and most of the suspects that they originally had were ruled out, save for 2 of them. So we'll go a little bit into those 2 suspects because they actually both have to do with the same sort of motive of why they may have killed the family, and one of these suspects is actually considered most likely to have done the crime, and I will explain a little bit more about that after I review them for you. So the first suspect is Carl Gabriel, who is Victoria, the daughter of Kezilla and Andre. He was a soldier in World War I, and he reportedly died in France on the battlefield in 1914. However, his body was never recovered, and there are also reports after the murders that a man fitting his description could have been alive in Russia at some point. Now, there was heavy speculation, especially by locals and neighbors, that perhaps he had come back and returned because Victoria herself, during the time of him being away at war, got pregnant with her son Joseph. So her son was born out of wedlock with her husband, and the father of this child was heavily speculated. Now, some neighbors believed that it was, and again, this is not a nice detail in any way, shape, or form, that he was the product of an incestuous relationship with Victoria and her father. So her 2-year-old son may or may not have been a byproduct of this abusive situation. Now, that seems a little far-fetched, but it's not quite as far-fetched as you would think. Possibly the part about an individual coming back who was very likely dead in a war that was quite prolific at the time. Everyone was involved in it in some way. It affected everyone's lives. But the parentage of Victoria's son would be something that would actually be the core of this case. And that brings me to the second and likely suspect, who is a man called Lorenz Slitzenbauer. And he was a neighbor of the family. So these families lived near each other on neighboring farms for many years. And Lorenz's wife died in 1918, so only a few years before the murders would have taken place. And pretty much right after her death, he started a relationship with Victoria. So he started a relationship with the daughter in this family, and then she later had Joseph, the son. So the parentage of this boy most likely is of this individual, Lorenz. And on Joseph's birth certificate, there is an LS spelling out that was his father, though because of the documents being from such a location, such a rural location, and not being well filed, they could actually mean the initials of an attending physician. So that is debated, but there are other details that link Lorenz to being the father of Joseph. And a series of actions. So Lorenz, on the day that the family was discovered murdered, he was one of the individuals that went to the farm to look for the members of the family. So he went into the house right after going into the barn, after finding the 4 bodies in the barn. He was alone in the home and entered the home independently. So he somehow got into the home. He may have had a key given to him by Victoria, was never confirmed one way or another, but the other neighbors present with him at the time questioned him as to why he went in the home without confirming if the killer was still on the property. So if someone was roaming around, you would think they might be afraid for their own benefit of not running into this person who had just murdered the people that they found in the barn, but he did not seem to really mind that. And then he located the bodies in the bedroom, so of Josef and of Maria. And he asked, he disturbed the crime scene. So when he went into the house, he was the first individual to actually commit the foible of just dirtying the crime scene and messing it up for the police. So he would have been the initiator of ruining any evidence that the police could have had any hope of collecting in this case. And for years following the incident, he also would make comments on comments about that day and just strange stories surrounding the discovery of the bodies, including a incident in 1925 when another neighbor found him on the property of the farm. The farm was actually demolished a few years after the murders because of the nature of the crime. And he was found on the property sort of wandering around, and this neighbor asked him what he was doing, and he said he was thinking about the murders, and he was thinking about how the killer must have wanted to bury the bodies that he had just left in the barn. However, the ground was too frozen to dig at the time. Now, this could just be a detail that Lorenz would have known because he was a farmer, and this would be something that would be happening. The ground would be frozen in March still at this time, but it was a highly suspicious comment, and this neighbor felt like it was so odd that he did report it to police and told other individuals in their town. And then, he sort of, I don't want to say faded into obscurity, but he died in 1941 without anyone having any sort of further contact with him about this case. So though he was exhibiting strange behavior, that sort of dropped off at about the time the inquests that I was mentioning before wrapped up. And yes, and he died then in 1941. The motive for the murder, if Lorenz was the killer, is speculated that he was being asked for money by Victoria for this child that they had. So she was asking him for money for Josef, this living and being brought up by her, since he was uninvolved in the child's life, and they could not have a proper relationship, and he may or may not have murdered her and the family to get rid of this issue, this problem. Now, there are a few modern takes on what happened. There are 2 very popular theories or studies or papers. One is a book that discuss this case, and you may want to look into it a little bit more. One is in 2007, and this is probably where I'm going to butcher German, so forgive me. Students in the police academy in Fürstenfeldbrunnen, which is a town in Bavaria, Germany, examined the case using modern techniques. So they took modern forensics and then put it up against what the police had actually collected. And there is this study of this is actually published online. However, it's only in German. So if you are one of my German speaking viewers, you can go find that. It's on, I believe, JSTOR, which is an academic paper website. I think that's available in certain ways to most libraries. I know that they had opened it up for free source a few years ago. I might be wrong about that. I'm very sorry if I am. However, Google, the academic search on Google may also result in you finding this. But it was concluded by them that most likely the killer was Lorenz. And the only reason that police or modern investigators have not brought that up to close the case is because he still has living relatives that are around, and they do not feel the need to disparage this individual because he is long deceased, and as most of the players in this case are, and the reputation of this individual is highly suspicious. So the modern investigators don't feel the need to essentially close this case all the way. Now, there's another interesting aspect or an interesting parallel of this case to another case called the Villisca Axe Murders, which happened in Iowa, Villisca, Iowa, and that was in 1912. And there is a book called The Man on the Train, which I would, Man from the Train, not on the train, Man from the Train, which is a book that details several axe murders that may or may not be connected to each other in the United States during the early 1900s. And if you're a true crime enthusiast, I would absolutely recommend you read this book. It is very interesting, and it shows an early, a pattern that was common with serial killers because of the frequency of how people would use axes in their homes, which seems logical to grab a weapon that is so destructive and can be found in individuals' homes, but it is certainly an interesting theory. This case has, of course, is not the same individual, but the MO is very similar. So just sort of that kind of study and thought process is a fascinating one, considering that they took place 10 years and many countries apart. Thank you so much for joining me for another installment of True Crime and Tapping. As always, if you have a case that you would like me to talk about in this series, please leave a comment down below. I will happily cover it. I really enjoy talking about true crime because it is a fascinating subject for me, and I know a lot of my viewers like hearing about it. I appreciate you all watching this and listening, and please stay safe out there. It is going to be the end of the year, and here's wishing that we all have a better 2021. Thank you, everyone.